He bought an old rusty tractor for just $1 just to decorate his yard. But when he opened the hood, what he found inside changed everything. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The sun had barely risen over the pale fields of Iowa when Henry Cole stepped out onto the front porch of his farmhouse, coffee in hand, and looked out across what was left of his land. The soil that had once glowed rich and black beneath the morning dew was now a dull brown crust, cracked by weeks of sun and neglect. The drought had stripped it bare, and so had time. His tractor sat broken beside the barn, its paint long faded, its belt stiff with dust. The few cows that remained wandered listlessly near the fence, chewing on dry stalks that barely counted as grass. Henry was 58, but his back was older, bent by a lifetime of weather and work that no man should endure alone. His wife had been gone 4 years. The silence she left behind was the only thing that never aged. He set his mug down and looked toward the mailbox by the dirt road. Inside were bills, notices, and a folded copy of the Midwest Chronicle. He almost threw the paper aside until a small boxed ad at the bottom caught his eye. Estate auction, machinery, tools, antiques, property of Harold Goodwin, deceased. Henry knew the name. Goodwin had owned the old iron works outside Des Moines, a factory that shut down before the war ended. They said he'd been rich as a king, a man who never threw away a single bolt. The ad said there would be miscellaneous mechanical items, heavy engines, and agricultural equipment. Henry took another sip of his coffee and thought about his broken plow, the one that had rusted to stillness 2 summers ago. He had no business spending money he didn't have, but something about the word machinery stirred a flicker of the old curiosity that had once made him a tinkerer. He folded the paper, put on his cap, and decided he'd drive into town on Saturday. Maybe there'd be something he could use. Maybe, he told himself, there'd be something left in the world that still worked. The auction was held in the dusty yard behind Goodwin's old warehouse. Trucks and trailers lined the road, the air thick with the smell of diesel and iron. Men in work clothes clustered around the equipment, poking, guessing, bargaining before the bidding even started. Old combine parts, threshing drums, and corroded wheels lay in heaps like a graveyard of progress. Henry walked slowly, nodding at familiar faces, until he reached the far end of the lot and stopped. There, half buried in weeds and shadow, stood a massive hulk of metal unlike anything else in the yard. It was a tractor, or what had once been one ancient steel-bellied beast with a tall smokestack and riveted panels blackened by rust. The nameplate was still barely legible beneath the grime. Titan 1918. Its great iron wheels were sunk into the soil as though it had tried to crawl back into the earth. One of the auction workers stood nearby and laughed when he saw Henry looking. "That thing hasn't moved since the Hoover administration," he said. Goodwin brought it over from Illinois, said it was one of the first steam tractors ever built. Museum piece now, if you can find a museum that wants a ton of rust. Henry ran his hand along the flank of the machine. The metal was cool despite the sun, the surface rough like old bark. There was a strange dignity to it. The way it stood silent and heavy, forgotten but unbroken. When the auction began, the smaller items went fast. Engines, tools, even a cracked oil pump fetched $20. When they reached the Titan, the auctioneer smirked and called out, "Antique steam tractor. One of a kind, no guarantee of function. Who will start me at 50? The crowd laughed. No one raised a hand. 20? 10? Still silence. Henry felt something twist inside him. He raised his hand. 1, he said simply. The laughter rolled through the crowd like wind through corn stalks. $1. Well, folks, looks like we've got ourselves a historian here, the auctioneer chuckled. Sold. To the gentleman in the cap for $1. The gavel came down, and just like that, Henry Cole owned a century-old ruin. Loading the Titan onto his trailer took half the afternoon. The crane groaned, the chain snapped tight, and the iron beast finally lifted free of the weeds with a deep screech that turned heads across the yard. People stared as Henry climbed into his pickup, the rusted tractor chained behind him like a ghost of the past. As he drove home, the setting sun flared against its cracked steel skin, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed alive, glowing red like a coal in the dusk. By the time he reached his farm, the sky was dark. He parked the trailer beside the barn and climbed down, stretching his sore legs. The air smelled of dry hay and burnt oil. He unhitched the chains, stepped back, and looked at the Titan resting there, silent beneath the stars. "Worth $1, he murmured to himself. "Maybe more, if it stands proud enough." Over the next few days, Henry decided to clean it up. Not to run it, not really, but to give it a second life as a monument to what once was. He scraped off the loose rust, brushed away the dust, and polished the name plate until the letters shone faintly again. When he tried to pry open the firebox door, it stuck fast. He fetched a wrench, twisted, and the latch gave way with a metallic crack. Inside, the soot was thick and black, but something about the echo didn't sound right. He knocked once on the inner wall, expecting a hollow clang. Instead, the sound came back dull and heavy. He frowned, knocked again. Same thing. He took a hammer and struck harder, moving along the inside rim. The tone changed halfway up low, muted, as though behind the wall lay not air, but something solid. Henry stepped back. That wasn't how a firebox was built. He fetched a flashlight, pointed it inside, and squinted. Beneath the layers of soot and iron dust, the metal looked different. Newer, smoother, welded with precision. It wasn't corrosion. It was a second layer. The next morning, curiosity got the better of him. He set up his grinder, sparks dancing in the dim barn as he worked along the inner seam. The smell of hot metal filled the air, sharp and bitter. After a few minutes, the blade bit through. A sliver of light flickered into a narrow gap. Henry stopped, wiped his brow, and peered closer. Deep inside, something glinted, faintly dull yellow, like the reflection of brass or perhaps something else. He reached in with a screwdriver and tapped. The echo was soft, cushioned. He ran his fingers along the edge and felt cloth. He turned off the grinder and listened. The barn was silent except for the soft ticking of cooling metal. He could feel his heart beating. Whatever was hidden inside that steel chamber had been there for decades, maybe longer. He didn't know why or how, but he knew this. Someone had sealed that compartment deliberately. Night came. Henry sat on the porch again, the stars bright and cold above the silent fields. The Titan loomed in the yard, a black silhouette against the horizon. He thought of the laughter at the auction, the way people had mocked him for spending his last dollar on junk. He smiled faintly. There was something inside that tractor, and he meant to find out what it was. Tomorrow he decided he'd cut it open completely. The wind stirred through the corn stubble, and for a moment he could swear he heard a sound from the direction of the barn. A faint hollow thud like the settling of heavy metal or something shifting within. He froze listening, then silence again. He stood, looked toward the dark shape of the Titan, and whispered under his breath, "You've been asleep long enough." In the pale moonlight, a flicker of reflection glimmered faintly through the crack he'd cut earlier, just enough to remind him that what he had found wasn't rust, wasn't brass, and wasn't simple machinery. It was something hidden, something sealed. And by morning, he would know what. Morning came cold and bright with a sky so clear it looked brittle. Henry woke before dawn, the thought of the Titan already burning in his mind. The memory of that dull golden glint inside the firebox haunted him through the night. He barely touched his coffee, barely tasted his toast. The world outside seemed far away, distant, as if all that mattered now stood waiting in the barn, silent and sealed. By the time the first light cut across the fields, he had his tools laid out, the grinder, the hammer, the torch. The barn door groaned open in the smell of old oil. Rust and damp straw rolled out to meet him. The Titan loomed inside, dark and immovable, half bathed in the pale light of dawn. The cut he had made the day before was still there, a thin wound in the blackened metal. He put on his gloves, crouched, and set the grinder against the seam again. Sparks leapt and hissed, painting the walls orange as the blade bit deeper into steel that should have been long dead. The sound echoed through the barn like a growl. When the final plate came loose, it fell with a heavy clang that shook the floor. Behind it, revealed for the first time in a century, lay a narrow cavity, the space barely large enough to fit an arm. Inside, wrapped in layers of brown oil-soaked canvas, were 3 rectangular bundles stacked neatly on top of each other. They were smaller than he expected, each about the size of a loaf of bread, but so dense he could hardly lift them. He set the first one down on the workbench, cut through the strings, and peeled back the fabric. Gold, not paint, not brass, real gold, heavy and unmistakable, its dull yellow glow catching the light through the barn's cracks. The surface bore markings, stamped numbers, and the faint outline of a crown beside a star. Henry stared, disbelieving. The second bundle contained more of the same, but mixed among the bars were papers, thick yellowed sheets with fading ink. He lifted one, careful not to tear it. The language was English, typed and stamped, though some notes were handwritten in another script. Manifest number 14, Industrial Reconstruction Shipment, Property of the War Department, 1919. He flipped through them, each bearing a similar heading. At the bottom of one document, he found a name, Captain E. Hughes. Another bore a seal from the Department of Commerce. There were numbers, cargo weights, and a line that read, Shipment rerouted by special order. Rotterdam, New York, Chicago. It made no sense. The Titan was a tractor, a machine meant to plow fields, not carry government cargo. Yet, here were official papers, perfectly preserved, hidden inside its boiler. Henry opened the third bundle and found something stranger still. A folded map drawn on thin parchment. One side covered in faint red pencil lines that traced routes across the Atlantic and into the American heartland. Scrawled in the corner were two words, hold until recalled. He felt a chill crawl down his spine. The handwriting looked deliberate, elegant, military. Whoever had done this hadn't been hiding from chance. They'd been concealing something valuable, something forbidden. Henry sat for a long time, just listening to the quiet hum of the morning. Outside, the wind moved through the cornstalks with a low whisper, but in the barn the air was thick, still reverent. He thought about taking the bars to town, about showing someone, but the idea made his stomach turn. Gold this old, marked with government seals, couldn't be sold like scrap. There would be questions, investigations. People would come, and they wouldn't leave empty-handed. He decided to hide it for now. He found an old feed sack, wrapped the bars and papers tightly, and carried them to the far end of the barn where an unused grain bin stood. He lifted the wooden floor panel, lowered the bundles inside, and covered them with a sheet of rusted tin. Only when he was sure they were out of sight did he breathe. Later that afternoon, he went inside for lunch, though his appetite was gone. The radio murmured in the corner about the falling price of corn, about the coming winter, but he heard none of it. His mind replayed the words from the documents. War. Department, 1919. What had Goodwin been part of? Was he smuggling gold from Europe? Was the tractor a cover? It seemed too elaborate for an ordinary theft. This had been a mission, an operation buried under decades of silence. When night came, the wind picked up, sweeping across the fields and rattling the windows. Henry sat by the fire, staring at the flames, his hands stained with oil and soot. He thought about his wife, about how she would have told him to let it go, to tell someone. But the thought of losing it, the only thing that had given him purpose in years, made his chest tighten. He couldn't give it up. Not yet. Around 10 o'clock, a low rumble passed along the road outside. Headlights flickered across his wall for a brief moment, then disappeared. He stood and looked out the window. The night was black except for a faint dust cloud hanging in the air. The sound of an engine idled far off, then cut suddenly. The next morning, he found tire tracks in the soft dirt near his mailbox. They led up the lane, but turned away before the gate, as though someone had stopped to look. He brushed the marks with his boot, then went back inside. By evening, his unease deepened. As the sun dropped low and red behind the barn, he took the flashlight and went out again to check the Titan. The machine stood silent, unchanged, but something about it felt different now. The space inside the boiler was empty where the bundles had been, a hollow cavity that seemed to breathe in the darkness. He ran his hand over the cold metal, feeling the seams, the welds. Whoever had built the second wall had done it with precision. It wasn't makeshift. It was deliberate military engineering. As he turned to leave, a glint caught his eye near the wheel. He crouched down and found a single boot print pressed into the dust, fresh, larger than his. The pattern unfamiliar. It led away toward the road. He straightened slowly, the air around him suddenly colder. Someone had been there, close enough to see everything, close enough to touch the machine. That night, Henry sat awake by the kitchen window, the shotgun leaning against his chair. The farm was quiet, but in the distance, at the edge of the fields, he saw a faint flash of light, too brief for lightning, too steady for fireflies. It blinked once, twice, then vanished. Somewhere out there, someone was watching his land, watching him. He poured himself another cup of cold coffee, the surface trembling slightly in his hands. His thoughts went back to the gold, to the papers that spoke of missing shipments and government seals. It had been hidden for a reason, and now that reason might be waking with it. When dawn came, he walked back to the barn, half expecting to find the Titan gone. It wasn't. The light through the boards painted the floor in stripes of golden dust. He opened the door and stepped inside, his footsteps echoing softly. Everything was still, but as he reached the tractor, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A faint scrape mark along the outer panel, as if someone had tried to pry it open from the outside. He touched the mark with his fingers. It was fresh. The fields outside lay calm under the morning sun, but the calm no longer comforted him. Somewhere beyond the horizon, he could almost feel a pair of eyes fixed on him, waiting. Henry turned toward the road and narrowed his gaze. Whatever was hidden inside that machine had belonged to powerful hands once, and by uncovering it, he'd stepped into their shadow. He didn't yet know who they were or what they wanted. But as he stood in that quiet barn, the gold sealed away again beneath the floorboards. He knew one thing for certain. His life, once ordinary and silent, had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. That night, as darkness gathered once more and the cicadas began their steady hum, he sat by the window and saw the same pair of headlights stopped just short of his gate. This time, they didn't move for a full minute. Then, slowly, the engine started and the car backed away down the road until the sound faded into nothing. Henry watched until the last trace of dust disappeared, the pulse in his throat loud as the ticking of the kitchen clock. Something told him this was only the beginning, that the Titan had not yet given up all its secrets, and whatever waited behind them was not just history, but danger. He turned off the light, the outline of the old tractor faintly visible through the barn doors across the yard, and whispered to himself in the dark, "So be it. Let's see how deep this goes." The following morning, Henry awoke with a sense of unease that no cup of coffee could chase away. The discovery inside the Titan had changed everything, and yet nothing on the surface seemed different. The field still stretched silent and bare. The air still smelled of dust and iron. But now the quiet around the farm felt heavier, as if something unseen had settled over it. He couldn't shake the memory of the boot print near the barn, nor the headlights that lingered by his gate in the night. Someone had been there. Someone knew. He decided he couldn't work the farm that day. Instead, he'd go into town, where at least the noise of people and the rhythm of the world might drown out his thoughts. He told himself he was only going to look into the history of the tractor to understand where it came from. But part of him knew he was searching for an answer to a question much larger than that. The local library stood on Main Street, a squat brick building with dust on its windows and the smell of old paper in its walls. Inside, the air was cool and quiet, the way it always was in places that had forgotten time. The librarian, a thin silver-haired man named Weller, recognized Henry and nodded politely as he approached the counter. Henry asked if there were any archives or newspapers from the early 1900s, particularly around 1918 or 1919. Weller gave him a curious look, but led him to a narrow room lined with metal drawers. For hours, Henry sifted through yellowed pages, scrolling through headlines about armistices, soldiers returning home, industrial progress, and farm machines being repurposed for peace. And then buried in a 1920 issue of the Midwest Industrial Review, he found the name Harold Goodwin, the same Goodwin, whose estate auction had yielded the Titan. The article described him as a mechanical innovator and war contractor known for building heavy machinery for military transport and later for agriculture. But halfway down the column was a line that made Henry's stomach tighten. Goodwin's company briefly investigated in 1919 for the loss of government assets during industrial shipment transfers. Charges dismissed. Loss of government assets. The phrase echoed like a hammer. The documents he'd found inside the Titan, though stamped with the War Department seal, couldn't be coincidence. He flipped through more papers, his hands trembling slightly. Another clipping dated months later described a mysterious fire that destroyed one of Goodwin's warehouses and ended all pending inquiries. After that, his name disappeared from the record like smoke fading into the sky. Henry sat back, staring at the scattered pages. The pieces began to connect. Goodwin had been moving something for the government, something valuable, and some of it had vanished. Perhaps he'd hidden part of it inside one of his own machines, the Titan. And then time had done the rest, burying the secret under rust and memory. He left the library just before dusk. The streets of town were quiet, the sky bruised with the colors of evening. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, he caught a reflection in a shop window. Someone across the street, standing too still watching him. The man wore a dark coat and a hat pulled low, face obscured by shadow. Henry turned fully, but before he could cross the road, the figure stepped back into an alley and vanished. Driving home, the sense of being followed returned. A pair of headlights appeared in his rear-view mirror. Steady, distant, never passing, never falling away. Mile after mile, they stayed behind him until at the turnoff to his farm. They finally disappeared. But when he pulled into his yard, his pulse froze. The barn door was slightly ajar. He climbed out of the truck, shotgun in hand, every nerve taut. The evening was still, only the soft rasp of the wind moved through the weeds. He pushed open the barn door slowly, the hinges creaking loud enough to make his heart pound. Inside, the Titan stood exactly where he had left it, but the ground was marked fresh footprints leading toward the corner where he'd hidden the bundles. The tin sheet covering the hole in the floor had been shifted. His hands shook as he pried it up. The gold and the papers were still there, but one thing was missing. The map. The folded parchment with its red pencil routes was gone. In its place lay something new, a plain envelope, yellowed and sealed, resting neatly atop the canvas. He tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, freshly typed. "You don't understand what you've uncovered," it read. "Do not contact anyone. Do not dig further." Some things were meant to stay buried. There was no signature, no address, just that. He stood there in the dim barn light, the paper trembling between his fingers. Whoever had written it had been close enough to know exactly where to find the map, and close enough to warn him. He stepped outside, scanning the fields, but the road was empty. Only the sound of crickets filled the night. He folded the note, slid it into his pocket, and locked the barn. Sleep didn't come easily. He sat up late, staring at the worn photograph of his wife that hung above the mantel. "You tell me to walk away," he muttered. "But what if I can't?" The house creaked in the night, and every sound seemed amplified. The ticking of the clock, the rattle of a loose shutter, the distant bark of a dog. Around midnight, he rose and went to the window. The road was empty again, but a faint glow pulsed far out by the tree lean, as if someone had lit a cigarette in the dark. It disappeared seconds later. By morning, Henry's resolve hardened. He couldn't stay ignorant. He had to know the full story, whatever it cost him. After breakfast, he drove to the county office claiming to research family land records. Using that pretext, he searched through property logs tied to Goodwin's company. One entry stood out. Industrial Agricultural Storage Facility, leased 1919, decommissioned 1920. The address was only 30 miles away. He jotted it down, but before leaving the clerk's desk, he asked about the name H. Goodwin. The clerk frowned, said he hadn't heard it in years. But funny thing, he added, last month, a couple of men came through asking about those same records. Government types, maybe. Didn't give names. That afternoon, back on the farm, Henry stood in front of the Titan again, staring at the blank space where the secret compartment had been. The air in the barn felt heavy, almost electric. He reached out and touched the cold steel, tracing the seams of the false wall. Whoever built it had known what they were doing. This was no farmer's handiwork. It had been made to last a century. As he stepped back, the sound of tires crunching gravel broke the silence. He turned and saw a pickup slowing by his gate. It was his neighbor, Joe Harris. Joe waved and climbed out, grinning like always, though the grin didn't reach his eyes. "Heard you've been tinkering with that old monster," he said. "Need a hand?" Henry forced a smile. "No, just cleaning it up. Rust won't quit on its own." Joe nodded, walking closer, peering at the Titan with an odd intensity. "Ain't many of these left," he said quietly. "Looks solid, though. Shame to see it just sitting there." His hand brushed the surface of the boiler, lingering too long. When Joe finally left, Henry waited until his truck disappeared down the road, then went straight to the barn. Something was wrong. He checked the grain bin, the floorboards, even the small latch near the corner. Everything looked untouched until he noticed a smudge on the concrete near the door. It was the shape of a boot sole, the same kind he'd seen before. That night, the phone rang once, then went silent. No voice, no message, just the faint hum of a line still connected somewhere. He hung up, heart pounding. He didn't yet know what the men wanted, or how far they go. But as he sat there staring at the dark silhouette of the Titan outside his window, he felt a truth settling deep in his chest. The gold, the papers, the map. It wasn't just an old secret. It was a thread that connected him now to something much bigger, something dangerous. Outside, a storm was building over the plains. Low thunder rolling in the distance. The windows rattled with the first wind. And in that flicker of lightning, Henry thought he saw a figure standing by the fence, motionless, watching. He blinked and it was gone. But the feeling remained, crawling up his spine like cold steel. Whatever he had uncovered in that ancient machine was no longer just his secret. It was awake, and it was watching him back. The storm that had rumbled across the plains through the night left the next morning washed and silent. Puddles glistened in the ruts of the old road, and the air smelled faintly of wet dust and iron. Henry hadn't slept. He'd sat at the kitchen table until dawn, turning the envelope over and over in his hands. The words printed on the thin paper echoed in his head. You don't understand what you've uncovered. The more he thought about them, the clearer it became that whoever had sent the warning knew far too much about what was inside that machine. He couldn't ignore it anymore. If the golden documents inside the Titan were only a fraction of something bigger, then there had to be more, some clue among the papers he hadn't yet read. By the time the first light touched the barn roof, he was already there, kneeling beside the hidden cache. He laid the remaining bundles out carefully on the workbench and began to open each one. The smell of oil, dust, and old paper filled the air as he unfolded the letters. The ink faded, but still legible. The first few pages were formal correspondence between men who signed their names with military titles. Their words were careful, bureaucratic, laced with coded language. They spoke of special shipments and transfers for reconstruction, always avoiding the word gold. Some letters bore both American and British seals. Others had been written by hand. The penmanship elegant but hurried. In one of them, Henry found the name again, Captain E. Hughes, alongside another signature, Major R.T. Kellerman, United States Army Liaison, 1919. The letters told a story of cooperation between governments after the First World War, a program meant to rebuild devastated industries in Europe by moving raw materials and precious metals across the Atlantic. But buried among the formalities were hints of something darker. One note marked confidential mentioned missing crates. An investigation quietly closed, and a warning that if the assets are not delivered in full, the matter will be considered handled outside official record. Henry set the papers aside, his pulse quickening. Another envelope, smaller than the rest, contained several personal letters handwritten, smudged with what looked like oil. They were addressed not to officers, but to someone named H. Goodwin. They began with words of camaraderie and ended with something like fear. You are playing with fire. One read, the government may forget, but the men who financed this won't. He pushed back from the table and rubbed his eyes. It was all there. The whispers of a crime hidden under the mask of patriotism. The Titan had been built to move gold, not grain. And the men involved had covered their tracks by turning the machine into a relic of agriculture. And yet somehow Goodwin had kept a portion for himself, sealing it within the machine's heart. By the time Henry looked up again, the afternoon sun had shifted, painting the barn's floor with stripes of amber light. He decided to copy what he could, photographing the letters with his old digital camera and storing the images on a memory card. The originals he returned to their canvas wrappings, placing them back into the grain bin. He didn't trust anyone, not even his neighbor, especially not Joe Harris. He spent the next few days pretending to work, fixing fences, and hauling feed. But his mind was never far from the Titan. Each night when he looked out from the porch, he half expected to see headlights creeping down the road again. And then one evening, as the sun fell behind the ridge, a familiar truck pulled up to the gate. Joe stepped out, waving a hand, his smile wide and too casual. Thought I'd come by and see that old contraption of yours, he said. Heard you got it shined up real nice. Henry forced a laugh, hiding the unease that crawled up his neck. Still just a heap of rust. Haven't had time to do much. Joe's eyes flicked toward the barn. Mind if I take a look? I always like these old machines. My grandfather had one, you know. There was no good reason to refuse without drawing suspicion. Henry opened the door and followed him inside. Joe walked around the Titan slowly, touching the wheels, running his hand along the frame. His movements were too deliberate, too precise. as if he were searching for something. "She's got good bones," Joe said, bending near the boiler. "Funny, though, you'd think something this old would have rotted clean through." Henry said nothing. Joe straightened, nodded once, and smiled. "Well, don't let her bite you. Old metal's got a way of hiding surprises." When he left, Henry locked the barn behind him. The silence afterward felt oppressive. He stood for a long time staring at the padlock, knowing in his gut that Joe's visit hadn't been neighborly curiosity. That night, rain began to fall again, soft at first, then harder. Henry tried to read, but the unease gnawed at him until he finally went back to check the barn. The lock was still intact. He almost turned back when he noticed a faint glimmer on the ground, a reflection from something metallic. He crouched and found a small brass button, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't his. He stepped inside. The Titan loomed in the darkness, its iron skin slick with moisture. He ran his flashlight along the floor, and their footprints, muddy and fresh. Someone had been inside. He rushed to the corner where the cash lay hidden. The tin cover had been shifted slightly. He pulled it up, heart hammering, and his worst fear was confirmed. One of the bundles was gone. He tore through the bin, searching, but it was futile. Whoever had been there knew exactly what to take. Beneath the empty space was a scrap of paper torn from one of the letters with a single phrase written across it in a hurried scrawl. "Stop digging." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the barn for an instant. Henry backed away, clutching the note. The air was thick with the smell of rain and metal. And somewhere beneath the thunder, he thought he heard the faint growl of an engine starting far down the road. He ran to the doorway just in time to see a pair of tail lights vanishing into the distance, swallowed by the storm. He shouted after them, but his voice was lost in the wind. The rain came down harder, soaking his clothes, but he didn't move. The message was clear enough. He wasn't the only one searching for the truth anymore. When he finally went back inside, he sealed the remaining letters in a tin box and locked it in his old gun cabinet. His hands were shaking, his thoughts tangled between anger and fear. The Titan stood silent once more, but he no longer saw a relic when he looked at it. It was a vault, a secret that had already claimed lives long before his, and perhaps would again. By the time he collapsed into bed, dawn was only hours away. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of rain and distant smoke. His dreams were shallow and restless, half memories, half warnings. And when he woke, the first thing he saw through the fogged window was the Titan's dark shape against the horizon, glistening in the gray light, as if watching him. He knew now that he couldn't keep the secret buried any longer. But before he could decide who to trust, he'd have to learn just how far the shadow of that old machine reached, and what kind of men were willing to kill to keep it buried. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray stillness that clung to the fields like smoke. The puddles on the dirt road reflected the pale sky, and the Titan, washed clean of dust, stood in the yard like some ancient monument that refused to decay. Henry sat at the kitchen table with the note in front of him. The words, "Stop digging," burned into his mind. He hadn't slept, not really. Every creak in the house, every gust of wind against the windows had felt like a warning. Whoever had taken the missing bundle had done it quietly and confidently, as if they'd known exactly what to look for. That meant someone close, someone who had been inside the barn before, someone who knew his habits. He didn't need to guess who. He drove into town after sunrise. The police station was small, 2 rooms and a front desk manned by a young deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Henry told him there had been a break-in, that someone had stolen documents from his barn. The deputy wrote it down, asked a few half-hearted questions, and said a report would be filed. But there was something in his tone, something detached that told Henry the case would be forgotten by lunchtime. They didn't understand what was at stake. Maybe they couldn't. He left without waiting for a follow-up. On the drive home, he passed Joe Harris's property. The man's truck was gone, but the barn door stood open, and something about that bothered him. He slowed the truck, eyes narrowing, but the road was empty. When he got back to his farm, he locked every door and window and went straight to the phone. It was time to stop playing blind. If no one in uniform would listen, maybe someone else would. He remembered an article he'd read months ago, a column about old war relics and government secrets written by a journalist named Sarah Keller. Her name had stuck in his mind because she'd written about another hidden artifact discovered by accident, a story the authorities had tried to suppress. He found the paper folded in a drawer, called the number printed beneath her name, and waited. The line rang for what felt like an eternity before a woman's voice answered. She sounded skeptical at first, as anyone would when a stranger called, claiming to have found government gold inside a 100-year-old tractor. But the moment he mentioned the War Department seal and the date 1919, her tone changed. She asked questions, precise, informed questions, and by the end of the conversation, she'd promised to come see him the next morning. Henry hung up, feeling both relieved and afraid. Bringing in an outsider might expose everything, but he couldn't carry this alone anymore. That night was the longest of his life. Every time a car passed on the road, he thought it might stop at the gate. The clock on the wall ticked loud enough to seem hostile. He finally gave up trying to rest and sat by the window, shotgun across his knees, watching the faint outline of the Titan shimmer under the moonlight. The gold was still hidden, what remained of it, but the knowledge was no longer his alone. Secrets like this had gravity. They pulled people in, dragged them under. When Sarah arrived the next morning, she wasn't what he expected. Younger, sharper, with a calm determination in her eyes. She listened without interrupting as he told her everything from the auction to the hidden compartment, from the letters to the theft. When he finished, she asked to see the documents that remained. Together, they went into the barn, and he showed her the letters and the photographs he'd taken of the missing map. She studied each page as though memorizing them. "This isn't just stolen gold," she said finally. "These are government records from a post-war fund, assets meant for Europe's recovery. If someone diverted them, that's embezzlement on a national scale. And if Goodwin hid his share, there's no telling who still wants it covered up." Henry felt a shiver crawl through him. "You think they're still out there after all these years?" Sarah met his eyes. The gold might not matter to them anymore, but the proof, the papers, those could ruin reputations, families, entire companies that were built on this money. People kill for less. They agreed to make digital copies of everything and store them in multiple places. That night, Sarah booked a small motel room in town, while Henry promised to keep watch over the original documents until she could contact someone she trusted in Washington. For the first time in weeks, he felt like there was a plan, but the illusion of safety didn't last long. 2 days later, a black sedan pulled into the yard. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, moving with quiet confidence. Their smiles were professional, their words smooth. They said they represented a private estate with historical claims and that they'd heard about the discovery of a certain tractor. The taller one handed Henry a card with no logo, just a name and a number. They offered him a substantial sum for the machine, far more than it was worth in scrap, even far more than the gold might have fetched on the black market. Henry didn't answer immediately. He asked who had sent them. The shorter man smiled faintly and said, "Let's just say we're trying to prevent unnecessary confusion. The offer," he explained, "would remain open for 48 hours. Then they left, their tires whispering down the gravel road. Henry stood in the dust, the card trembling slightly in his hand. He didn't need to call the number to know the truth. These weren't collectors or historians. They were cleanup men sent to buy silence. He called Sarah that evening, but there was no answer. He tried again and again. Finally, he drove to the motel and found her room empty, her car gone. The clerk said she'd checked out early that morning. She hadn't left a message. Panic clawed at his chest. He returned home just as the sun was setting, every shadow on the road stretching longer than it should. That night, the phone rang. A voice he didn't recognize spoke softly on the other end. "Mr. Cole, you're in over your head. That gold belongs to history, not to you. If you want to stay alive, destroy what you found. Burn it. Bury it. Forget it." Then the line went dead. Henry set the receiver down slowly, his hand trembling. For a long time, he didn't move. The farmhouse was utterly silent, except for the wind pressing against the walls. Somewhere outside, a door creaked, a faint, slow sound from the direction of the barn. He picked up the shotgun and stepped out into the night. The yard was empty, but the barn door stood open, swinging slightly on its hinges. He went inside, every sense alert. The Titan stood in the dark, massive and still. But something was different. The floorboards near the grain bin were lifted. He rushed forward and tore the cover away. The canvas bundles were still there, but the papers were gone. Every document, every letter. Only the gold remained. He stumbled back, heart hammering. The intruders had been here under his roof while he'd been inside the house. The message was clear. They could take whatever they wanted. By dawn, he had packed his truck with what was left, the gold, the photographs, his tools. He locked the farmhouse and drove without looking back. His destination was the office of an old lawyer in Des Moines, a man who handled estate disputes, and more importantly had contacts in government circles. It was time to end this. When he arrived, the lawyer listened, pale-faced as Henry told his story. He examined the photos, the seals, the markings on the gold bars, and finally said, "If this is authentic, and I believe it is, the best thing you can do is turn it over officially. There are laws about found property, especially of historical origin. The government will take it, but they'll owe you restitution, and they'll keep you alive." Henry agreed. Together, they began drafting a statement. It was almost evening when the lawyer's assistant entered the room, saying there was a phone call for him. He stepped out to take it. Minutes later, he didn't return. The receptionist said the caller had hung up. Henry waited uneasy. When the lawyer came back at last, his face was ashen. "Mr. Cole," he said quietly, "I think we're being watched. 2 men just parked outside. Don't look out the window. Leave the papers here and go." Henry's breath caught. He reached for the bundle of photos, but the lawyer shook his head. "Go now. I'll contact the right people. They can't silence all of us." Henry hesitated only a moment before nodding. He left through the back alley, climbed into his truck, and drove into the fading light. As he turned onto the highway, his phone buzzed once with a text from an unknown number. "The lawyer can't protect you. Stop before this kills you." He didn't answer. He drove faster, heart pounding, every mile, taking him farther from everything he'd known. By the time he reached the county line, the sky had gone black. He pulled to the side of the road and sat there for a long time, the engine idling, the weight of the gold heavy in the seat beside him. Somewhere out there, powerful people had started moving. He could feel it in his bones. He thought of Sarah, vanished without a trace, of the lawyer's white face as he told him to run, of the men in suits who offered money for silence. There was no going back now. The wind moaned through the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of rain again. Henry gripped the steering wheel and whispered to himself, "If truth has a price, then I'll pay it." The headlights flickered on the horizon behind him, 2 points of light drawing closer, steady and relentless. The highway stretched out before him in a silver line, endless and silent beneath the dawn. Henry drove without direction, the truck humming low, the wind cutting through the cracks of the old window. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't even thought about anything except one thing: finish what he had started. The documents were gone, stolen, but the gold and the photographs were still with him. They were proof enough if he could get them into the right hands. The lawyer's warning echoed in his head along with the text from the unknown number, the one that said he couldn't be protected. Maybe that was true. Maybe protection no longer mattered. What mattered was that the truth didn't vanish with him. By mid-morning, he crossed into Des Moines again. The city was waking up, cars on the streets, people hurrying to work, the smell of coffee drifting from open shop doors. It felt strange to be among them, to see the world moving normally while his own had come unhinged. He parked behind the public library, left the gold locked in the truck, and went inside to use their public computer. The machine was old, the screen flickering faintly, but it connected. He opened an email account under a false name, attached the photographs he'd taken of the documents, and sent them to every government address he could find: the Treasury, the National Archives, even a few newspapers. When the final message sent, a strange calm settled over him. Whatever happened next, the secret was no longer buried. Outside, the air felt sharper. He walked back to the truck, climbed in, and started the engine. He didn't notice the black sedan parked 3 cars behind him until it pulled out too, following him through the narrow city streets. His pulse quickened. He turned twice, then 3 times, taking random corners, and the sedan stayed with him each time. Finally, at a stoplight, he caught a clear glimpse of the driver in the mirrored dark glasses, a clean suit, the same face that had come to his farm days earlier. He didn't wait for the light to change. The tires screeched as he turned hard onto a side street, and then onto the open road, heading south, away from town. The sedan followed for several miles before fading in the distance. He drove until the city gave way to farmland again, the horizon open and endless, the sky pale with the first edge of spring. When he finally slowed, he was near the old rail line west of the county where no one went anymore. The air smelled of earth and iron. He parked beside a derelict shed and turned off the engine. For a long time, he just sat there listening to the silence. He knew he couldn't run forever. The lawyer had been right about one thing. The government would take it all, but they'd keep him alive. It was time to end it properly. By evening, he drove back to the nearest town and stopped at the local police department. The same young deputy from before looked up, startled. Henry told him he had something for the authorities, something big. Within an hour, a call was made to the state offices, and by nightfall, 3 unmarked vehicles had arrived. Men in federal jackets came in quietly, their expressions a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. Henry handed over the gold bars, the photographs, and his written account. They photographed everything, sealed it in numbered crates, and asked him to describe exactly how he'd found the cash inside the Titan. The process took all night. By morning, he was sitting in a plain room across from a man in a gray suit who introduced himself as an investigator from the Department of the Treasury. The man's tone was measured, deliberate. He asked about the documents, about the missing bundles, about the people who had contacted him. Henry told him everything he knew about Sarah Keller, about Joe Harris, about the threats. When he finished, the man closed his notebook and said quietly, "You did the right thing, Mr. Cole. What you've uncovered will help us close an investigation that's been open for more than 100 years." Weeks passed after that. Henry's farm became a restricted area, sealed off by federal tape. Trucks came and went, carrying men and equipment. They opened the Titan piece by piece, documenting every bolted plate, photographing every weld. Inside the boiler, they found traces of compartments Henry hadn't discovered. Smaller cavities where documents had once been stored, but had long since decayed. The recovery became a story whispered through government corridors, though officially nothing existed. The case was classified, archived under a code name he would never learn. One morning, a federal agent came to his temporary apartment in Des Moines with a letter from the Treasury Department. It was official recognition of his role in the recovery of historical assets of the United States government along with a legal settlement, $6.5 million. Henry stared at the paper for a long time, the weight of it unreal. It wasn't the money that struck him, but the finality of it, the closing of something that had defined his life for months, maybe for longer. With the reward, he bought back his farm. The first thing he did was rebuild the barn, replacing the rotted planks with new ones, strong and pale against the sky. But he left the spot where the Titan had stood untouched, a patch of ground that still bore the deep grooves of its wheels. When the government finally returned what was left of the machine, a stripped shell of steel and rivets, he had it mounted there on a stone foundation. They gave him permission to keep it as a historical monument in recognition of public service. He placed a small plaque at its base. Titan 1918. Found in silence, returned in truth. The years that followed were quiet. The farm thrived again. He hired workers, restored the fields, planted new crops. But sometimes, when the light hit the metal just right, he could still see the ghost of its past life, the gleam of hidden gold, the shadow of men long dead guarding their secret. Children from the nearby school came to see it, their laughter echoing across the yard. And he'd tell them that sometimes the past hides in the places you least expect, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to listen. Then one spring evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, a letter arrived in his mailbox. The envelope bore no return address, only a European postmark. Inside was a single page written in neat, old-fashioned script. "You have done what others could not." It read, "You restored not only what was lost, but what was stolen. From memory, my grandfather served under Captain Hughes. He would have thanked you. Consider this his gratitude." It was signed with a name Henry didn't recognize, followed by a small symbol, a crown, and a star. The same insignia that had been stamped into the gold bars. He folded the letter and slipped it into the same box where he kept the Treasury certificate. That night, he sat on the porch, watching the fireflies rise over the fields, the silhouette of the Titan standing dark against the fading light. For the first time in a long time, he felt peace. He knew there were still things he would never understand. Why the map had been taken, who Sarah Keller really was, or what became of the men in the black sedan. Some mysteries weren't meant to be solved completely. Some belonged to time itself. When he stood to go inside, he looked once more at the machine that had changed everything. The wind stirred through its hollow frame, carrying a soft metallic echo that might have been imagination or perhaps something else. A final whisper from the past. Rest now, he said quietly. You've carried your secret long enough. As he walked back toward the house, the last light of day caught on the Titan's steel ribs, glinting faintly like buried gold. Somewhere beneath its foundation, deep in the earth that had seen too much, a faint reflection shimmered for a heartbeat before fading into the soil. Henry didn't see it, and maybe that was for the best. The land had its own way of keeping one last secret. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe. There's plenty more coming. Hit that like button to help more people find these hidden truth tales, and share this video with someone who loves mystery and discovery. And before you go, check out our next story. Another unbelievable real-life secret waiting to be uncovered.